Welcome everyone to our October 2018 class for segment 1. We are going to continue with a 4-part series on chart interpretation. And what we're doing is we're looking at 4 different charts. And so each time we get an entirely different situation to look at in regards to a volunteer example and how their chart is actually operating for them. Before that, though, just a quick housekeeping slide on our audio podcast that we do every week. The Astral Library, which is all the general and forecasting information, shows up. And then, of course, our Evolutionary Astrology course and its 3 segments that you can see on your screen. And so as we look at this chart interpretation, we are going to be using what's called the planetary method of chart interpretation that was developed by Jeffrey Wolf Green. If you're not familiar with this, Jeffrey actually received this methodology in dream state and then put it into that trial and error, or what we call observation correlation, and fine-tune this methodology that we're going to look at today. Now, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask them on the Q&A panel of your screen, and Leroy will answer whatever questions he can. And if you want to interact and ask something live, then you can raise that little hand signal on your panel that you see there. And so, first of all, what we're going to look at is the fact that a chart will not show you the gender of the soul involved. You've got to observe and correlate. Nor will it show you the evolutionary state of consciousness within the soul. And by that, that is that consensus individuated and spirituated states of consciousness that EA talks about. And if you want more information on that, I'm going to refer you to the beginning of our webinars that we started in January of 2014, and we go over those evolutionary states in detail. And so you have to, again, look at that, observe and correlate to determine that evolutionary state of consciousness. And then another thing that I've kind of, it was there in Jeffrey's teachings, I formalized it a little more and gave it the term environmental conditionings. You've got to know whether that person is, what country did they come from? Were they raised by 2 parents? Did they have any religious background? Were they raised in lower middle class or a silver spoon in their mouth? All those kind of different conditioning factors is going to be relevant to the chart. One of the things we can do in chart interpretation is assume that we know how an archetype is operating for any specific person. Anytime you want to make that type of projection and assume, the universe is going to bring you something different to say, ooh, observe, correlate. Now, here are the different environmental conditionings that I have put into a little list. And if you're a volunteer for any class with EAN, you will provide this information to us in your own words before we even, begin to look at your chart. It's not always necessary to know the evolutionary state of consciousness. I rarely know that when I draw in a client. It is something that we have a tendency to explore together over the course of a session. Now, if you're someone who's been studying evolutionary astrology for a while and you volunteer for your chart for class and you feel you kind of know where you're at, it's okay to bring that forth, but it's not an absolute or a necessity at the beginning of any session. Allow it to be open and explore. And it's something that when you are either a beginning student of astrology or you're really first starting to read charts, even in the world of EA, it may not be something that you can just grasp really fast. It's just, it's like anything else. It's like I'm always saying, you know, you don't play expert tennis with your first lesson. How many of us got on a bicycle and were able to ride it the first time? It's practice, practice, practice. And it's something that you get better at the more you practice. So just remember that and take a little pressure off of yourself if you don't feel like you can discern that evolutionary state of consciousness real easy. Another basics that we're going to go over in each class for this little series is the Mars-Pluto phasal relationship and any specific aspects. One of the other things from Jeffrey Green's original teachings is that if you want to determine the number of lifetimes that a soul has been working upon a specific Pluto house, you can have an ability to discern that by the Mars-Pluto phase. And so it's not a specific number. A soul gets to choose however many lifetimes they want to work on that specific Pluto house according to their whole desire and intent. What is the urgency to evolve? Or I need a little bit of break. I'd rather go at a slower pace. The soul has free will with that. Now, there were what we call primary and secondary lifetimes. And those primary lifetimes are more life-changing, life-altering, opportunities for, you know, maybe a little more specific evolutionary leap of growth. And these are the specific 45-degree aspects that Mars will make to Pluto. And this is one area where I, over time, have gotten a tendency to use a smaller and smaller orb. And that was also original to Jeffrey's teachings as well. And so I have said, you know, 5-degree orbs. Sometimes Jeffrey would say a 2 or 3-degree orb. He would vary in a lot of his conversations and his teachings. And so a lot of us who have followed his method for a while, and I'm, oh, where am I? 33 years and counting. We would kind of go, well, what was the majority of the opinion that he would offer over time, and then kind of stick with that. Secondary lifetimes were when Mars and Pluto were in a phasal relationship to each other, but there was no specific aspect, or the aspect was something other than the 45 degrees, such as a sextile or a trine. So let me show you this as an example here with what we call the generic cycle of phases and aspects in the circle, those 8 phases from 0 to 360. And so here in this example, Pluto is always going to be at the 0-degree point in the natural circle, and Mars in a new phase conjunction to Pluto would be 1 specific lifetime. Mars at the 45 degree, either I would go 5 degrees approaching it, 5 degrees after it, okay? Or you can shorten that down if you want. This would be a second primary lifetime. If it was a sextile, it'd be a secondary lifetime. If Mars was a quintile, waxing quintile to Pluto, secondary lifetime, here'd be the third primary lifetime, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if you want to, you can even go to 9. But so the rule of thumb was that there would be at least 8 specific primary lifetimes, or 9 if you want to bring it to the balsamic conjunction, counting new and balsamic conjunctions separately. And so you could just look in the chart and get some grasp at how well the soul was starting to get a hold of that specific Pluto house natally. And in that regard, then also how well it was starting to grasp the polarity point. If Mars was new phase Pluto and they're just coming in to start lessons again in that specific house, they may not have a lot of experience with that polarity point. Versus, say, if Mars was a balsamic conjunction to Pluto and Mars was hanging out these last few degrees from Pluto, that would mean they'd have, at least 8 specific or primary lifetimes. So they'd have a little more experience with that polarity point. Again, just giving you some generics here on how you can start to look at, again, how many lifetimes the soul's been working on it. Now, another question to address: do we work through all the lifetimes in one specific Pluto house before moving on to another? I don't have the absolute answer to that. Personally, I think we could skip around. Maybe one lifetime we are a first house Pluto, then we're a 6th house Pluto, then we're 9th house Pluto. But as we're working through each of those specific houses, we're sooner or later going to have to go through those 8 specific aspects of Mars to Pluto to really grasp that soul energy and the soul lessening. And the way that I guess I kind of come up with that answer is, I think some of us pop back and forth in our Pluto generations. We don't wait 250 years to come back and incarnate in the same Pluto generation as the one we were in the last lifetime. So it's not linear in my understanding of it, and I could be wrong. It is just like us humans. We're very multifaceted, and we learn in a variety of different ways. Okay, so let's just look specifically at the chart that we're going to work with today. And I just want to give you the background for this volunteer. And we will hear from our volunteer periodically as we go through these next few hours. This month we have a female born February 3rd, 1968, 10:47 p.m. in Hayward, California. And in your studies, if you replicate the chart, it's Alameda County. There's more than one Hayward, California. We're dealing with a 12th house Pluto like we did last month, but last month we had a 12th house Pluto in Leo. This month we have 12th house Pluto in Virgo with Uranus new phase. This female volunteer was the 7th of 8 children. Dad was Caucasian. He died when she was very young. Mother was Hispanic, born and raised in Mexico, migrated to the U.S. Mother passed when our volunteer was 25. There were 4 older brothers, one who was sexually inappropriate with her from age 5 until she stood up to him at age 8, threatening to tell mom. He then went back and forth with it. She never did tell mom, but he was a young adult, left for the military, left home. That might have changed the situation as well. She's fairly close to her 3 sisters, 2 older. There's 1 younger sister. They're a little more religious than her. She was raised with a Catholic background. In college, she joined the Unification Church, which is considered to be a little more cult-like. Had a life of almost celibacy. While she was in the church, it was an arranged marriage, and it was not consummated until there was a decision to have children. She left him with the 2 children and got involved in a second marriage right after. This husband, the second husband, turned out to be quite controlling, and when she got the courage to leave him, long, nasty custody battle over their son. She was falsely accused by ex-husband of abusing the son. She ended up with that going for 10 months with no contact with her son. She fought it out and didn't give up, and now they actually share custody of her son, and she is in a new long distance relationship. She's aware of her issues with codependency, and she has a work background in the property management area. So let's just move right in and into that planetary method and start looking at what we will call the karmic dynamic, or where the soul is coming from. Now, again, we're using these slides from some of my original classes when I went through the planetary method. If you need help with any of the basics, I refer you back to those earlier classes. And every monthly email you get from us, there is a PDF file which you can download that lists all of the classes from January 2014 to the present moment. It was in early 14 when I switched from audio conference calls to these webinars with video and PowerPoint slides. So you can go back and get more detailed information on the planetary method of chart interpretation if you need to. And so the first thing that we will look at in EA is where natal Pluto is located. Pluto is representative of the soul, and it's where we will naturally gravitate to for unconscious emotional security reasons in this life. And where Pluto is natally by sign is the generation we were born into, where we as a generation gravitate to for a security basis. And then where Pluto is by house is where our own individual soul will gravitate to for security reasons. So let's just look at this dynamic alone for this volunteer chart. As we stated earlier, we have Pluto in Virgo, 22.5 degrees, and it's retrograde, and it is in the beginning of the 12th house. Before we go into that, though, I'd like to just point out that this volunteer chart has an ascendant or rising sign at about 19 degrees Libra. And so the sign on the cusp of each house is the opposite of what it naturally rules. Libra naturally rules the 7th house, and it's over here on the opposite. And this is the Aries house, and Aries is over here on the opposite house cusp, the 7th house cusp. What it will do is it will typically put a planet in a sign that's opposite of the natural house. And this can be true not only of a Libra rising, it can be true of the Virgo rising showing up here, and it can be true of the Scorpio rising showing up here. With Virgo and Scorpio risings, it'll vary a little bit as to whether it is the sign that rules the opposite house by a sign or two. You just have to look at each planet specifically in question. Sometimes it will vary with the Libra rising as well. But one of the basics that we look at from the perspective of evolutionary astrology when there's a Libra rising is a phenomena that EA calls the emotional paradox. When all the signs are on the house cusps opposite of what they naturally rule, it sets up that natural opposition. And so it can feel like there's a dichotomy going on, or there's a split within the soul going on. And specifically with the 1st and the 7th house cusp, that emotional paradox is it will describe a history with a soul where they go back and forth between sense of self and others, where they feel that they have to choose to have a relationship with themselves or a relationship with others. And it can feel like an either or choice. I've got to choose me or someone else. And what you're trying to evolve towards with this type of rising and planets all sign opposite house is basically to be able to balance those opposing forces within your own soul. And just being able to tell a client with, these types of house cusps in their chart, you're not going crazy. You're not an either or. It's just the natural mechanism for your soul to understand two sides of the coin and balance. And it's going to be natural to go back and forth. So let's just use this as an example here with just Pluto itself. And you can do this with every planet in its archetypes if they are actually sign opposite house. And so we're going to start off with the Pluto Virgo generation here. And many of you, if you've been reading Pluto Volume 1 or working through the webinars on Pluto in the 12 houses / signs, Pluto Virgo, ruled by Mercury, left brain, analytical generation, knows how to tear things to pieces. I like to say this is the health nut generation. This is the computer generation. All of that diet, exercise, and rest and health and wellness came into being as this Pluto came into popularity as the Pluto and Virgo generation was growing up. And this is the generation that really made computers and electronics kind of a household thing that we all don't even live without anymore. And yet the generational lesson for the Pluto Virgo, and here were some Jeffrey Greenawald terms, Pluto Virgo is deductive, analytical, tear it to pieces. The polarity point, Pisces, is inductive. The whole is greater than the pieces that make it up. Pluto and Virgo generation came here to be disillusioned with their beliefs and to rebirth them, Pisces polarity. However, if we look at this example here, and we put Pluto in the 12th house, we're going to know that this is a soul who's had prior life experience gravitating towards religion, spirituality, or the rebellion and objection to it. Now, this volunteer feels that she's kind of in that transitioning back and forth between third individuated, first spirituated. And so that alone is going to tell you atheism belongs in second stage individuated. I am rebelling against everything consensus, organized religion and consensus, all the way through the individuated state is clinging to consensus religions, rebelling against it, and searching out all types of religions, trying to put it all together, the big picture together. So here we have a soul who can have both of these things operating within her. Some type of religion doesn't satisfy me anymore, but I have a deep yearning to understand a belief system. So you see how you're starting to bring all this in? Now, I could talk for 2 hours on a 12th house Pluto. We're going to have to put it in here as we go through the next few PowerPoint slides over the next couple of hours, okay? But let's just say, in general, a 12th house Pluto, sometimes I loosen it down to, oh gosh, I've got to come to planet Earth again. It's so, mean and cruel here. I don't know if I can do it. And so they will sometimes be in denial in various ways, or out of their body in various ways, or the traditional astrology, drugs, addiction, imprisonment belongs to 12th house Pisces. And so the 6th house polarity point for a Pisces soul, Pluto in the 12th, the 6th house polarity point is learning how to be here on planet Earth and be in their body and put one foot in front of another. Coming from the Pluto Virgo generation, the soul is going to have had prior experience with that. With Pluto retrograde, all this is going to be rebelled against even more, against the left brain analytical stuff, against not wanting to be here on planet Earth, and yet propelled to be in their body, 6th house retrograde, propelled to be rebirthing their belief systems one way or another throughout this entire lifetime. Now let's quickly add in the rulers for you here. And so Pluto's ruler by sign, Virgo, is Mercury, over there at about 2 degrees Pisces in the 5th house. And the ruler by house is Neptune in Scorpio, over there in the 2nd house. And everybody born right now throughout most of the last century has Neptune in a waxing sextile to Pluto. You can see right here, sets up a yod with the 7th house cusp. We'll get into that more. But Mercury, ruler of Pluto by generation, is over here in Pisces 5th house. So this is going to be someone who is a little more right brain orientated in regards to the Pluto and Virgo generation. If that Mercury would have been in the 3rd house, or it would have been in Aries or Gemini, or, the 5th house, me, myself, kind of counteracts it, but we've got a little more intuitive Mercury here than the typical Pluto and Virgo generation. All right. Let me just stop at this point and let our volunteer introduce herself, and then we'll move along into the Pluto aspects. So, Leroy, let's bring in our volunteer. Oops, I just dropped my glasses.
Hello.
Hello there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy
to be here.
Oh, you bet. I'm asking, I'd like, I have a question for you right off the bat, okay?
Sure.
How do you feel your Mercury operates for you in that 2 degrees Pisces 5th house?
I've heard traditional, as they call it, cookbook astrology, talking about, how Mercury does well in Pisces. And so I've really thought about that a lot. And kind of when I really look at my life and how I interact with that, I've kind of recently been thinking about this a lot. And I feel like for me, I look at I don't do anything in my life without communicating with God, or I'm trying to change the term from God to spirit, because, I have a Catholic upbringing. I'm trying to kind of, I'm a recovering Catholic. Look at it like that. So something that when all this child custody thing happened, I bought a pendulum, and I, because I was going through a lot of trauma with the whole experience, I was constantly using my pendulum to ask questions. Maybe because of the Libra thing, I'm very indecisive about things, and to make decisions about things is very hard for me. And in the beginning, when I used it, I felt like I was getting sometimes too dependent on it. But I, when I relate to my questions that I ask with that pendulum, you know, at first I believed that I'm talking to, you know, my higher guide, spirit world, whatever you want to call it, but I believed that I was communicating, and whatever kind of response I would get, I wholeheartedly, faithfully would follow that advice, even if I didn't like it at times.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard someone say once when I finally looked up, I never really studied how you use a pendulum or anything. I just started using it. And when I did watch a video on it on YouTube once, it was saying that the lady was saying, you know, that she looks at it like it's picking up on your energy and saying what in your like higher mind, what you really believe is, you know, like your feeling about whatever it is that the question that you're posing, and that it's really just reading your own energy. And I thought about that, like that's my own energy, so that's not coming from, you know, the higher realms. And then I thought, well, you know what, but that is, because I'm part of that higher realm. That is
Mm-hmm.
me, and yet it's not me all at the same time. And
Mm-hmm.
so I still use that pendulum, especially when I'm struggling to, you know, not knowing what to do. But then I kind of look at it, I am, you know, it's me getting the answer from me or
Mm-hmm.
spirit. So I kind of don't see them separate, although they are separate. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
let's just point out for our listeners, you know, the rulers of Pluto, the soul, you know, this Mercury is in a first quarter square to Neptune, you know, 5 degrees beyond, but it's still 95 degrees. It's still a first quarter square here. So there's almost a crisis in action between left brain Mercury and whole brain Neptune. Sometimes in EA we'll say Mercury left brain, Jupiter right brain, and Neptune whole brain. And that's bringing in that whole mutable quadrant right there. And so I would say, you know, listening to you and observing to you, while there's some self-doubt here that might go on, you have a soul that's really trying to tune into intuiting where things are at for you, and then okay, what supports that, what are the details that support that. And yes, you go with that until you reach a limitation, and you have to let something old go and expand beyond it. Or another way of saying this in the classic 12th house Pluto way, you go with moving forward the best you can intuit and discern until you run into that cycle of confusion, as we say with Neptune, Pisces, 12th house, and you just have to surrender and let go and say, okay, source, now what? And so it's your own way of balancing that whole left brain, right brain thing, you know, being in that metaphysical world with your feet on the ground, which is you're always trying to straddle both sides. And again, that's Pluto, Virgo in the 12th house. And it's not a right or a wrong. It's just the way your soul is operating. All right, let's bring in our next slide here quickly. And by the way, if I say something and you have feedback to it, jot yourself down a quick little note, because Leroy's going to be pretty back and forth with muting and unmuting just for the quality of the recording, okay? Let's move in then. And so the next thing we want to add on then is how many aspects. We've already kind of looked at is Pluto retrograde, but what are the number of aspects that Pluto makes? And in EA, if there's just a few aspects, you know, 2, 3, maybe 4, that's a slower evolutionary pace for the soul. And if we start to get into 5, 6, 7, 8 aspects that Pluto makes, and I include all of them, major and minor aspects with that cycle of aspects and phases we looked at earlier, the more aspects they are, the faster or the stronger that evolutionary pace is for the soul to evolve. So if we want to here now, we're bringing in every planet that has an aspect to Pluto. And I've jumped in to bring the nodes in because they are aspecting Pluto as well. Remember I said everybody born has Neptune waxing sextile Pluto? Well, look at, of course, we've got a 1960s baby. So we're going to have a Uranus conjunction to Pluto. And in this case, it's new phase by about 6 degrees, and they're both retrograde. Oh, and look at, we have planets over here opposite Pluto. Mars is that gibbous opposition. Remember we talked about those primary lifetimes in each of those 8 45-degree aspects. One of them is the opposition, and it's only 2.5 degrees off, or 2 1/3 really. And so, this is a primary lifetime for this soul. Primary lifetime, how? Everything that we're talking about in regards to a 12th house Pluto and its polarity point. And with Mars sitting there on that Pluto polarity point, it is activating it, and it is intensifying that give and receive, me versus you, the polarities of the signs and houses, and that ability to balance that oppositionary energy together. In practical terms, this is going to be balancing giving and receiving in relationships in general, just because Mars is opposite Pluto, and the opposition in general in the cycle of phases and aspects is how do I be in relationship with myself and others at the same time? How do I balance equality and fairness with others at the same time? We also have Chiron, full phase opposition to Pluto, opposition to that Uranus. And then what starts to come in here is, remember we pointed out the yod with the 7th house cusp? Well, I use wide degrees with yods, and we've got the moon and the north node at 20 degrees here. So here's a yod right here. And if we start to look at this for this 12th house Pluto, and I didn't speak too much about Neptune a little bit earlier, being in Scorpio and being in the 2nd house. The Neptune and Scorpio generation is, as they evolve through a lifetime, they really have to get in touch with turning that psychological dynamic in upon themselves. Lesser evolved Neptune and Scorpio can be quite manipulative and controlling, and I've got to have all the power in order to feel secure. As Neptune and Scorpio evolves through individuated and spirituated states of consciousness, then it really starts to look at itself and go, oh, wait a minute. Returning or separating forces, which one am I going to align with? Am I going to take the high road or the low road, so to speak? And so this will be a little intensified when it brings in a yod with a 7th house cusp and the moon and north node right there in Aries. I'm skipping ahead just a little bit. We're still going to work with the south node, but here we have someone who's trying to initiate and find themselves, especially on emotional egoic levels, and they're doing it through relationships. And so the adjustments, as we call the yods, and there can be a waxing in conjunct as the moon is to Neptune, and it can be a waning in conjunct as the moon is to Pluto. Again, it's chart interpretation. These classes are not beginners. So if I'm skipping over something, go back. Okay, go back. I did a 5-part series in the cycle of phases and aspects. Go back and do the math review class first, which was the last one I taught. Then go through the 4 classes on the phases and aspects. The point is here, okay, there can be inner doubt, outer adjustments. There is the insecurity of who I am, especially with my feedback in relationships. And it just triggers her deeply on a soul level with regards to her beliefs. And if we start bringing in this Uranus new phase Pluto of the late 60s, these are rebellious souls. They're trying to break free. New phase conjunction, retrograde. They're trying to break free from all of their soul's old conditionings. What would these old conditionings be with Virgo 12th house for both of these planets? Any area where this soul, allowed herself to be taken advantage of. Cannot do it this lifetime. Look at her own feedback here. Long custody battle over her child with a controlling, manipulating, here it is showing up right here, a partner who was outright, lying about her son. So I could keep rattling, but let me at this point, Leroy, could you please unmute our volunteer? Leroy, if you could you unmute our volunteer? Sorry, volunteer. I don't know.
Kim?
Are you there, Leroy?
I apologize. I'm sorry. Yes, there. Barbara, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, I apologize for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Volunteer, feedback.
Yes. Yeah, it describes very accurately. It's been difficult, but I feel like I've grown so much through it. And, even though it's difficult, I guess I can see, that it's helped me be who I am. And, at this point, I just kind of feel more or less I just want to help other people that have gone through similar experiences. And definitely, through relationships, I've always felt, I don't know, completely what you said about not wanting to be in this world. And it's never ever been in the sense that I want to commit suicide. It's not like that. Somebody's asked me that before. Like, no, it's just I don't feel comfortable. And having to fight for your child against some horrific allegations was like really it really brought me into this world, because I'd say, where I had to fight even though I didn't want to. I still catch myself not wanting to fight, but it's still going on, where I'm getting a lot stronger. I mean, I've been to court like 7 times in the last 7 months, and a lot of those were initiated by me. So yeah, it's very,
just initiated by you, just in standing up for yourself.
Correct.
And relationship with your child, and standing up for fairness and equality with the ex.
Right.
Yeah, so you can start to see this strong theme of relationships is coming through here. And it could beg the question of, was there some past life patterning in which you did not stand up? Because one of the other equations with the Pluto and Virgo generation can be self-doubt, those feelings of being less than when compared to someone else, Libra following Virgo. And, you know, so, and if you look at these planets that are, you know, opposite Pluto, you know, sacrificing of self, you know, thinking you were doing the greater good, and maybe having 12th house confusion, you know, and confusion can come with Virgo as well, because that mercurial Mercury, do I or don't I, you know, mental whirlwind thing that can go on. And so, you know, there could be some self-doubt and confusion about, you know, what's highest and best for me, or what's highest and best for all concerned. And you would think you were, you know, sacrificing yourself for the good of someone else, for the good of a situation, and maybe came to recognize through the experience, you know, wait a minute, not standing up for myself is not healthy. 12th house Plutos can bring about lessons with healthy boundaries, because they're even more intense than Pluto in Libra or 7th house. That 12th house, there's that, you know, we're all one. And so that not knowing where I end and you begin, there's lots of times 12th house Plutos have lessons with healthy boundaries. And so I think just the intensity of how you may have, you know, and have been having to stand up for yourself in, you know, this situation, it's showing this lesson of healthy boundaries and what's fair and what's right, and, you know, moving beyond the doubt, and, you know, learning to trust your intuition just on a gut instinctive level, way beyond the pendulum.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something that may be a little latent in you, if I may, when we have a Mars-Pluto opposition, okay, it, and again, this can be Mars-Pluto in each of the 8 specific 45-degree aspects, okay, the semi-square, the square, you know, the sesquisquadrate, and so on. Those Mars-Pluto aspects, Jeffrey will call them evolutionary gates. And so there was an intensity or buildup in which the soul has to take evolutionary steps forward. And when it's Mars in an opposition to Pluto, it's how do I act in relationship to another? On the gibbous side of that opposition, there's a vacillation between standing up for yourself and not having the courage, gibbous side, to stand up for yourself. If that Mars was, say, 26, 27 degrees, and a full phase opposition to Pluto, there would be a lot more aggressiveness, perhaps, within your soul's nature. And others might stand up to you and say, wait a minute, fairness, balance, fairness, balance. Works both sides, but on the gibbous side, it's a little more, you know, while we have to make the adjustments of how we're going to be equal in relationships, it's the gibbous Virgo side. It's the fear of doing it. And so we get a little pressured to do it. Whereas the full phase Mars, Pluto, you know, F you, oh, I'm going to get you, you know, can sometimes be a little stronger. That makes
Right.
sense?
Yeah, completely. Because with this whole court stuff, you know, we had 50-50 custody and I was still paying him child support. I was trying to get that changed, but he was putting many blocks up to it. and causing many delays. He's an expert at causing delays within the court system and creating a lot of confusion as well. And there was a point where I was just like, I just don't even want to, I don't want to go to court anymore. I just want to like just settle with him and, not ask him for, because, try to just say, you go your way, I'll go my way. But, so I tried to have a conversation with him, would you be willing to, what would you be willing to offer, because he should be paying me some child support, but we got 50-50. He makes more income. I have a ton of debt from court, we've been in court with attorneys and stuff in Washington, but no attorneys in this last year, which has been good because I have to deal with him myself. And he has, pushed my buttons, and I've had this rage come out of me like I never even knew I had. But because, he would say things, well, I think it should be zero, that I give you nothing, or that you continue paying me. So I said, you know what? I just, cursed at him and said, forget it. I'll see you in court. Because, he makes a ton more money than I do as well. And his offer was, you continue paying me, or let's just make it zero, and couldn't see that I was willing to even say zero in the past, but because of all the stuff that has developed and, the dishonesty, and not only that, just all the bills that I've had, I kind of felt like I was on the verge of just saying forget it. But then things would happen like that, and then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm feeling so violated here that I'm going to just go to court and see what happens. So now he's paying me, as of like last month. He's now starting to decide that there are certain things that he doesn't want to pay, but I guess, what am I trying to say? Yeah, I definitely feel myself on the Gibbous side, what you were saying, because I've wanted to just so many times just give up, but for some reason I wouldn't, and I would just feel like I'm not going to let this be treated like this.
It triggers the Chiron Uranus opposition of all the prior lifetimes of woundedness, and going, wait a minute, I have to stand up for myself. I don't want this pattern in my soul anymore.
Yes.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. It's not easy, but and sometimes this is part of the Neptune and Scorpio to 12th house Pluto, but it's also this Uranus new phase and Pluto itself. It is that making the effort, Pluto Virgo, towards what you perceive to be highest and best for yourself and your perception of it with relationships, and making that effort regardless of how it turns out.
Yes.
And remember, this is what we talk about in general. This falls into the Neptune Pisces 12th house archetypical theme, whereas Source is more interested in your effort than how it turns out. Because this is an imperfect world. But if we all intend, how do I put my best foot forward? How do I put my best foot forward? And in your case, looking at this chart, again, there's so much in here that says the struggle with what's fair and equal. Let me move us on, okay, sweetie? Let's bring in that south node, all right? And so here, part of that karmic dynamic is the natal south node, which is that ego from the past, how we operated in the past on emotional levels that allowed that prior karmic dynamic of Pluto by natal sign and house to be actualized. So we also, and then this is the third part, even though there's sign and house, I just want to emphasize those. The third part of the karmic dynamic or trinity of the past is the ruler of the south I'm going to start a recording again as well, just in case, Leroy, in case we have to pop something together. All right, everyone. Thank you for that. I just lost everything on my computer. It literally shut down on me. So here we are, back. And so what I'm pointing out here next for you then, as we're going to move in here into South Node, again, the ego of the past that allowed the soul to come through on a more conscious level. And then we're going to include the ruler of the South Node by sign, which is going to be Venus over here in Capricorn, 3rd house. And the ruler of the South Node by house is Mars over here in Pisces, as we've been talking about for quite a bit, being in that opposition to Pluto. But it's even got another signature to it, which is the South Node. Leroy, you may want to mute yourself, honey.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you for your detail work, Media Monk. So, I want to point out something right here. The mean motion of the nodes is clockwise, okay? Which is the opposite of the way that the houses go. And so this South Node is balsamic, the ascendant. The South Node is finishing up a whole cycle of evolution here. And when it crosses over the ascendant, because its mean motion is backwards, the South Node's going to start a whole brand new evolutionary cycle on an egoic level of rebirthing. So this right here gives us a bit of a clue that this soul's ego has spent the most recent past lives, and including this life, is really bringing a lot of old karma in relationships. And if we want to say Libra, I think we could even, with her environmental conditioning, extrapolate that we're talking intimate relationships. She's really wanting to bring a lot of these old relationships to a close in regards to herself. And she's really wanting to heal some of these old patterns of inequality, Libra, and how much effect it's had upon herself. And I would say relative here to a 12th house Pluto in Virgo, there may have been confusion around what's fair, what's mine, what's my partner's, what's healthy and balanced between us. And remember, traditional astrology will sometimes assume that Libra is already balanced. And there can be time periods when you see that Libra or 7th house signature, it's going to describe the extremes of imbalance. And when you have a Libra rising, you have someone who is orientated towards the other person. And sometimes on an instinctive level for first house. And sometimes they can be orientated towards that other person at the expense of themselves. And so then you have Aries over here on the 7th house cusp. And it's about finding themselves through relationships. But this signature right here, this brings in an old egoic pattern of the soul being orientated towards the other at the expense of themselves. And you can hear that in what our volunteer says and her own words and her environmental conditionings. Now, if we bring in the two rulers of Venus to Mars, what we can start to see here is that Venus is already in what we would call last quarter phase. If Venus was right here at about 20 degrees Sag, it'd be the last quarter aspect. it has moved about 20 degrees beyond that, but it's still the last quarter phase as we're looking here with Venus and Mars. This too is another clue that, you know, Venus and Mars as a planetary pair, how we perceive our values and needs around relationships and then go about achieving that. Venus and Mars describe our intimate relationships. And this is someone who, last quarter phase of Venus to Mars, is just a phasal relationship. It's like, I want deeper value and meaning in my relationships. And if you put this relative to this south node here, this is someone who is like, deeper value and meaning for me is I can't keep giving myself away in relationships. And this can be reiterated as we talked before, that Mars in Pisces 6th house, I'm going to sacrifice myself and, you know, just bend over backwards in a relationship. And how come I'm still getting hurt? Oh, this opposition gibbous, learning how to stand up for myself. Venus in Capricorn 3rd house, do I or don't I? Which actions do I take? When you have a planet, sometimes when you have those personal planets in Capricorn, Moon, Mercury, Venus, it can take a while for that planetary archetype to unsuppress. Think of Capricorn, 10th house, all of the consensus conditioning we will come up through. And think about the, you know, loss of father early on, no healthy male role model, an older brother who is very, you know, domineering and threatening. And think of how that would have an effect on this Venus in Capricorn. And so, you know, she might have some idea of what's right versus wrong, but it could have been so easily suppressed. Not to mention, okay, so I'm talking specifically, you know, just roles with males as she's coming through. But in addition to that, sometimes Venus in Capricorn, there is a slow unfolding of what she values. And so she didn't know what to value in intimate relationships early on. This signifies that she wants deeper values, but relative to a 12th house Pluto and lack of healthy boundaries, she went into a church that arranged marriage for her. So can we start to get an egoic picture here of this is someone who has not necessarily stood up for herself in regards to intimate relationships in past lives. And yet, let's add in this, and then we'll bring our volunteer in. Excuse me, I've got to click here to get this to work. And then, of course, it's the aspects that the South Node makes in addition to this. So it adds on more detail to the picture of how the ego operated in the past, allowing the soul to function according to where it wants to gravitate for security reasons. And so I'm being very specific here and just bringing in some of the aspects to the nodal axis alone. Okay, and so what we're going to see here, okay, is that the South Node makes an opposition to the Moon. Now, let me just quickly point this out. Moon is here at 2020. The nodes are always compared to the planet, and the nodes of the Moon are compared to the Moon. So if we start at 2020 and we reverse going clockwise, because that's how the nodes go. The South Node is a gibbous opposition to the Moon. If the South Node was 20 degrees, 20 minutes, it would be an exact opposition. If the south node was 20 degrees 0 minutes, it'd be a full phase opposition. We have another gibbous opposition here going on, and it adds to even more confusion. Who am I? Who are they? What's me? What's you? What's fair? What's not fair? And if we want to, we're starting to bring in here this opposition of Mercury and Jupiter. Mercury left brain, Jupiter right brain. Jupiter is about 3 degrees Virgo retrograde, 11th house. We talked about Mercury because it's strong because of a rulership of Pluto. But Mercury is a gibbous opposition to Jupiter. That gibbous sign brings in the adjustments to fairness and balance, but it can also bring 6th house Virgo, that element of doubt, confusion, less than. And so this right here would start to tell us Mercury left brain in a right brain sign, Pisces. Jupiter right brain in a left brain sign, Virgo. This is the confusion or switching that takes place between left brain, right brain. That adds on to this Pluto Virgo 12th house picture. This is someone who early on in her early conditionings with this ego here trusted others to be more knowledgeable, to be more intuitive, to, you know, I'm going to just say this broadly, okay? Hear this archetypically. Trusting the guru to be wiser. So can we start to see how we can have lifetimes in which this person has given her power away to the other, be it the partner, be it the spiritual teacher or religious ruler in whatever way that we have going on. Now, what we have happening here is the south node is in a waxing sesquisquadrate to Mercury. And if we start with Jupiter and go clockwise, we have a waning semi-square to Jupiter with the south node. And so that tension aspect is adding to the picture of confusion, but it's also adding to the discomfort that says, wait a minute, what is right? What is wrong? And it's going to eventually throw this soul back in upon herself. And she's just going to have to, at some point in her life, go, I got to figure out what's right and wrong for me. Not what the system or the religious figures or the partner says is right or wrong. Let's bring in our volunteer for some feedback, and then we'll have to zip our way through the second half of the chart fast.
Thank you. Yeah, I could definitely relate to the point that you were saying that because of Venus being in Capricorn, there being a delay. And I did pretty much had the thinking, especially in my second marriage, where, it was all about the other person. And I had started I gave up, I went back to graduate school and I was trying to get like a master's in spiritual psychology, and finished 1 year, got back together with him, got pregnant, dropped that. I mean, I pretty much gave up everything and was happy to just be a housewife, and yet I wasn't happy, and I felt that I wasn't happy. So I know that I've done that. And it's not until I would say even, I'm 50 now, I would say, I feel like my life is really just starting now, to be honest with you, since I've ran into astrology recently, well, a couple of years ago, around the time that the child custody issue happen. So yeah, a lot of intensity. I mean, that is the word I keep hearing you say a lot. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I can laugh about things now. When I was younger, it would be, just I'd be in tears completely. I couldn't even talk about things, without crying. But now I feel like I, am starting a new life at 50. um, and have really had to ask myself a lot of those questions. I mean, I told you I have this guy that I met through a parental alienation support group that I was leading, and I met him because he was going through something similar with his daughter being taken away from him.
Mhm.
And I think, it's been a very, very, very slowly progressing kind of relationship, but through every interaction, I feel like we connect a little bit deeper. But it's been interesting that he's kind of similar to me in so many ways that it feels a lot safer than any relationship I've ever had before. And it gives us time, to get to know each other and build trust. And I feel like he's very, a lot like me, I guess I would say, afraid to lose himself in a relationship. And I'm kind of got that going on as well. And trying to definitely understand what's me, what's him. Do I even want to be in a relationship? I do, though I do really want one, but not knowing how to be in one and trying to figure all that out.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's one of the things with, I brought in your hoe chart right here, okay?
Okay.
So as we start to bring in the whole chart, we can see how we've got this Mercury-Jupiter opposition, and it draws in a square, a T-square to Neptune. So relative to being that 12th house Pluto, there's a recovery process of trusting yourself before you're going to be able to trust anyone else. And that includes trusting source. People don't always recognize that 12th house Plutos can have a lot of unconscious anger at source. How dare you be so mean and cruel? And especially if you've been conditioned through religion to believe that God is perfect and God, oh God, it's just, we can't understand it. We just gotta, bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other thing with 12th house Plutos, in addition to sometimes just that unconscious anger, there is this need to be able to trust themselves in the world as well as trusting source. And I might be a little prejudiced here, but so far for me, and I'm a decade older than you, okay, I haven't found anything better than EA to explain this messy place better. And when we can start to recognize, the reason the unmanifest manifested was in a desire to evolve and perfect itself, it kind of brings a little relief in. Oh, it's not some cruel old man up there judging me. It's a co-creative process with source. And as I expand and evolve, source does. And as I learn to align myself in a more co-creative process with source, I can start to minimize some of the pain. It's, stuff still happens, but I can start to understand the larger pictures about it more and more and more. And especially with this whole concept of reincarnation. I mean, how can you even talk about spirituality without bringing reincarnation into the picture? And, here's the tool to help us all understand it. It can bring some relief. It helps this T-square, let go and understand the to let go of the confusion and start to understand and trust your own intuition. and your own direct connect link with source, which then allows you to have a greater and greater sense of yourself. We haven't spoken about your sun. You know, you put a sun in Aquarius in the 4th house, and it's emotional objectivity versus being traumatized and just emotionally collapsing all the time, which is what that, you know, sun signature could have done for you, you know, early on. The bigger intent is to emotionally parent and love yourself, which allows you to become more and more objective about how, you know, you've created this karmic path through history. The other picture is that this Venus, ruler of that south node by sign, is in a last quarter square to Saturn in Aries. And Saturn, that structure of consciousness, earlier Aries, the first third, okay, in the 6th house, that courage to act for yourself versus give up or sacrifice or doubt yourself. And so with that Venus in Capricorn in this last quarter square aspect to Saturn, you know, it's just, it's like you're just finally coming into being in your body here on planet Earth. And I'm very fond of this. I'm a walking cliche. I have too much Sag 9th house. The lesson comes when the lesson comes. The soul doesn't give a damn what your chronological age is. And so we might say, oh, you're 50, happy Chiron return. Yes, that's all part of the picture. But, you know, it's also relative to this 12th house Pluto and relative to, you know, South Node Libra in the 1st. And that, you know, again, ruler Venus of the South Node last quarter square Saturn. You know, you're just coming into your courage and addressing all of this relationship karma. Right on time, babe.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to move us along, okay, so that we can hopefully get ourselves done as close to 4 o'clock as we can. Thank you, everyone. It's easier for me to rattle this off in a reading session than to teach it. I need 3 hours for chart interpretation. So here's where we flip everything around. And again, I'm not dealing with the variations of Pluto conjunct the North Node. You go refer back to the earlier classes for examples on that. But the rest of the planetary method of chart interpretation, we start looking at the evolutionary intent and what we've loosely called Trinity of the Future, Pluto polarity point, North Node, rulers of the North Node. It's expanded more than a trinity as I teach this because I'm very intent here on looking at the rulers of Pluto, looking at the rulers of the Pluto polarity point, looking at the rulers of both nodes, and as you see, we bring in the aspects as well. And you can even extrapolate aspects to the rulers of Pluto polarity point north nodes, but simplifying it as best as we can. So the polarity point of natal Pluto is where the soul is intending to evolve in the current life. And so we will look at that by where the polarity point is by generation and where the Pluto polarity point is by individual as well. And sorry, as you can see here, I'm trying to go too fast. Polarity point by sign is the generation. Polarity point by house is the individual soul lessons. So let's jump right in. And so what I'm going to do is just show you by screen. Pluto's at 22, Virgo 26. The polarity point is 22 degrees Pisces, 26 minutes. That's where the soul's intending to evolve. For sake of time, let's bring in the rulers as well. And so we touched upon this a little bit before because of that opposite sign house structure. The polarity point of Pisces by generation. It describes that Pluto Virgo lesson of disappointment and disillusionment with belief systems and needing to rebirth them. And for the Pluto and Virgo generation to be coming in at the end of the Piscean age, and again, we don't have a specific date as to when it starts or ends, okay? It's going to be a several hundred-year transition. But we kind of know we're at the ending of the Piscean age. So to me, this Pisces polarity point in general represents souls who are going, there's got to be more than just this consensus BS. Even if you look at it from the perspective of the Catholic Church and all of the sexual distortions that have went on, there's got to be more to it. I mean, even the consensus state of consciousness can go, why don't we let Catholic priests marry? Every other religion does. You can, so there's this Pisces polarity is really wanting to expand that whole brain concept of, natural law. And if I may, just very briefly, I say this a lot in sessions. Religion teaches us that God is male, the old man in the white beard out on the cloud, judging us. God is outside of us, and God is perfect. Well, why would something perfect create this mess? If you look at it from the natural law, observe, correlate, source energy is beyond a gender. It is an energetic force. It is not a male or a female. Source energy is everywhere, but we know it outside of ourselves to the degree we know it inside. It's a personal one-on-one journey. It's as simple as the conversation in your head. And the real biggie is that universal source is an evolving force. As I said before, every time we make a baby step forward, source itself evolves. So that's this Pluto Virgo generational lessons with the Pisces polarity point. You put this in the 6th house, and we will have a soul who won't just take anything on blind faith. They'll kind of want to see 6th house. It's the 6th house is an earth archetype. Well, I've got to live it. I've got to breathe it. My belief system has to be something that I do on a daily basis, just like I do my diet, exercise, and rest. And so they've got to be living, breathing their belief system, which, by the way, volunteer, a spiritually based astrology counts as one of those things. So there's your permission to study every day. Ha ha. Now, remember we talked earlier with the rulers of Pluto, okay? When we have that sign in opposite house, the rulers of Pluto and the rulers of the polarity point are the same. So the same two planets we take to look back on the past, okay, and some of this perhaps confusion, self-doubt that the soul would have here, these are also the rulers of the Pluto polarity point. And so first quarter square, crises in action. This is someone who's, just like I said, they have to be talking it. They have to be breathing it. They have to be doing it. They have to find the courage to just manifest the rebirthing of their belief system as they go through it. Now, one of the things we have a tendency to say in EA is that sometimes we'll come in and it's almost like we'll go through a Reader's Digest version of our past lives. It can almost be sometimes we go through a Reader's Digest version of going from consensus to individuating to spirituating, or individuating to second or third individuation, wherever we end up at. We're not going to make big leaps forward. We'll play with the, evolutionary state and substate before and after where we're naturally at. We can have a mix of some of that, but we can come through and just kind of relive to, accelerate the remembering on a soul level and move the soul forward. So look what she did, joining a cult-like church, moving from consensus Catholicism to a church that accepted all other religions. I'm not real familiar with unification, but yet had some, cult-like activities to it. And when thou shalt and shalt not, have sex or whatever those details were, to then now having to move beyond that stuff. And again, this is this ruler Mercury first quarter square to Neptune going, first quarter square, crises in action, gotta do it. Gotta live it, gotta be it, gotta breathe it. Leroy, let's bring our volunteer in for just a little bit and feedback.
Hi. Yeah, I feel like since studying evolutionary astrology, I just got into it. I want to say like in March, and I read the Pluto book, the first, in 1 month, just kept reading it, and it has helped me a lot to really understand myself, and has shed a lot of light. And I do feel like, it's like I mentioned before, I think in the email to you, that I feel like I found my calling, and I'm really excited. And it's like I can't stop studying it, actually. It's it takes most of my time besides the other duties that I have, and I really want to be able to put it into something in my daily life. I guess I haven't really thought too much about how I have to have the proof, but I'm always trying out all kinds of different spiritual techniques, or but reading books by different spiritual people. And I feel like I'm the kind of person that's very hard to keep a routine, that I don't like to be bound by routine, like I have to do this every day, kind of thing. But with astrology, it's just like natural. It's because it's got my interest so much that it's like, now that I think about it, because I was like just saying that, but that is kind of a routine. That's not something that I feel like I have to do, but it's I want to do. Yeah.
Just for clarification, okay, the prove it to me is the Neptune in Scorpio.
Okay.
Okay, because it's Scorpio who again has to have that visceral emotional experience. Okay, and it's part of the Pluto Scorpio 8th house archetype of actually being able to live it. The 6th house gets into it having to put it into a practical living experience. So there's a little discernment there between that Neptune Scorpio signature and the 6th house signature for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. But you will find as you go through with this, the rest of this life, as you start to look at that polarity point with this methodology and then those two rulers, okay, it starts to become more of a living, breathing, way of life for you. Rather than something that maybe is, church on Sunday or whatever. Okay.
That feels so much better.
Well, and it's natural law, as EA likes to say. It's just, this is life. And that, another strong cliche, one of my favorites with evolutionary astrology, is evolution takes place through the emotional body. All the spiritual wisdom, all the intellectual knowledge, but until it's put to a practical application of living it through the senses, the emotional body, we don't incorporate it. So evolution takes place through the emotional body, through the sensory experience. And that's one of the things about, that I love about astrology in general and EA specifically it shows us the living experience and the path to do it that way. Well, let's quickly bring in, of course, the aspects that the polarity point makes, okay? This is going to describe more details of that evolutionary intent of the soul. And again, the number of aspects, the more they are, give us an evolutionary pace. And if I didn't say this before, that every aspect that a planet makes to Pluto, they make to the Pluto polarity point, okay? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 planets, okay? Did I get that right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, 5, and I include Chiron. And then if you want to include the nodes, you've got 6 or 6 and 7 if you want to separate it. So we're going to have the same aspects that we looked at with natal Pluto. However, now let's look at them from the perspective of the soul's evolutionary intent. And in this case, what we have going on here is Chiron is new phase, the evolutionary intent. Remember that Pluto polarity point right here is 22 Pisces, okay? Chiron, you compare the planets and the nodes to the Pluto polarity point, just like you compared them to Pluto, okay? The Chiron is new phase, that Pluto polarity point. Mars is balsamic, that Pluto polarity point. Moon is a waxing semi-sextile. North node, because it goes backwards, is a waning semi-sextile. We're getting into a little detail here, okay? Neptune is a waning trine, okay, to the Pluto polarity point. And of course, we have Uranus in the full phase opposition to it. But let's just look here at the Mars and Chiron sitting on the Pluto polarity point. Remember how we talk in EA about Mars being the instinctual desire nature of the soul, or the leading edge of our desire natures. A lot of times it can be the leading edge of the separating desires. We're exhausting. But we also have a Mars in Pisces and a Mars in the 6th house, and so this is someone whose desire nature just naturally includes a spiritual path. Pisces, a path of how to be helpful and how to serve, 6th house. Chiron in Pisces 6th, healing herself. Chiron conjunct the Pluto polarity point. My soul's evolutionary intent is to heal myself. And if we look at it at how it's actually expressed itself in her life, you wouldn't call it the, love and light expression. It's been downright, dirty and nasty, having to fight, someone who's lying about her, an intimate partner who's lied about her. Someone who has, been full of betrayal in, loving a child. And so this is one of those Virgo, Pisces, archetypical, both of them, both sides of the polarity are involved here. Remember where we said earlier, you've got to, I like to say, judge less, discern more. And so it's not the end results. You know, you really got to look at what's the intent of the soul. And so healing for her is standing up for herself, even when on the outside it may not look nice or pretty. But it's what may be healthiest for her own soul. And with that moon, new phase to this Pluto polarity point, and we look at this north node, it's a balsamic conjunction to the moon. And so it's the surrendering into, I'm saying surrendering as the balsamic conjunction. Okay, it's really going, oh my gosh, I have to love myself. Here's this reiteration again that we're flipping from that south node egoic signature. I'm jumping ahead to the north node, okay? Mm-hmm. It really is, you know, new phase, semi-sextile moon to the Pluto polarity point, the courage to love myself and the courage to stand up for myself. And that surrendering into, it's okay to be me emotionally and love myself emotionally. I've got to be in a, you know, I've got to love myself before I can love anybody else. That comes into some of this healing picture here. And Uranus is new phase Pluto. And yes, that brings its own fair share of shock and trauma. Okay. And feet on the ground, 12th house into Virgo. Uranus is full phase to the Pluto polarity point. Okay. It can be part of that picture of the relationship upsets to wake the soul up. The Uranus and Virgo mini generation is, as some of what we've said before, they have to decondition all the distortions of Virgo and liberate into the healthy archetypes of Virgo. So they have to decondition cup half empty, see the cup half full. They have to be able to decondition the self-doubt and the worry warts, you know, and the less than, and, you know, the inner outer criticism. And they have to liberate into healthy service Virgo. As we've kind of determined before, you know, this soul with this whole polarity opposition here could have done the self-sacrifice or serve another in unhealthy ways with a lack of boundaries. Give until they were dead or nothing left. And so the Uranus opposition to the Pluto polarity point is going, wait a minute, little objectivity here. You know, and Uranus rules that sun in Aquarius, if you remember that part of the chart. Now, the Neptune waning trine to the Pluto polarity point, this is an eventual ability for the soul to really be able to intuit truth versus lies, to be able to trust themselves, to be able to trust source. We didn't talk about Neptune in the second house, okay? And that, you know, can get into a little bit of practicality on a spiritual level, just like Scorpio, I had said before, is like, you got to prove it to me. I got to be able to live it with my senses and experience it. Sometimes Neptune in the second house will get invested in outer securities versus inner, but sometimes there can be a spiritual laziness. Oh, this is comfortable. I think this is security because it's comfort. And they'll get, frog thrown out of the well. And so what eventually has to happen with this Neptunian signature is, a self-reliance, a spiritual path that allows for a deepening of self-reliance. And so again, I think eventually with effort, there gets to be an ease of spiritually knowing what's truth and what's not. And if you remember, we had the Mercury Pisces T squared in Neptune. We'll bring that in here. So volunteer, is this starting to clarify for you? You've got to work in that real world, 6th house, okay? Feet on the ground, but there is no neglect of spiritual growth for you. And I would say, especially, 3rd individuated transitioning to 1st spirituated. It's your spiritual growth has got to be a guiding force for you. And then again, as we spoke earlier, how do I live it? How does it become an aspect of everything in my life? And especially, how does it help me trust myself to then trust going forward in any intimate relationship settings? It starts to rebirth this yod, doesn't it?
Yes.
Comments, questions, volunteer?
Just absorbing.
That's okay. That's perfectly fine.
Thank you.
No worries at all, okay? Let's keep ourselves going for time-wise, okay? And I'm glad that you can go a few minutes later with my little hiccup. So now let's bring in the North Node. This is the ego we're developing emotionally in this lifetime, helping us to utilize that evolutionary intent of where the soul is desiring to grow. And of course, the rulers by sign and house with additional details. And so here with a North Node in Aries, just inside or just finishing up the 7th house, okay? So as this ego is moving forward, excuse my burp, we're really trying to culminate tail end of the 7th house. Initiations emotionally in relationships. This signature is almost like an urgency of how I create fairness and equality in this lifetime in my intimate relationships. Now, we've been working a lot with the marriage type relationships, but I look at the 7th house as anything beyond casual acquaintance because it squares 4th and 10th. It can also draw in the parental environment and draw in the career environment. Same 2 rulers of the South Node also rule the North Node. Remember how we talked earlier? There's going to be this slow yet eventual evolving with Venus in Capricorn 3rd. This is what I value. This is what I do not value. And it's going to take them a while to get in touch with their own values and needs versus just going along 3rd house and adopting everybody else's again. And this last quarter phase with Mars starts to signify this soul's been through a lot of intimate relationships, Venus, Mars, planetary pair, 3/4 of the way around the circle. And it's a deepening and deepening and deepening of what I want and need in intimate relationships. And they have to become more and more spiritually based, or at least broad, similar, um, deepening values of what it's like to be in intimacy. And then what do I got to do? I got to really practice that going forward in relationships. This is someone who is going to be meant to continue to initiate North Node Aries, practicing her spiritual growth and the deepening and broadening of her values, literally in relationships. And what did this volunteer do? She just described it to us. I didn't put it in the end of the environmental conditionings, and I perhaps should have, new long distance relationships that they're taking very slow. And as she said, they were both in, I thought you had a term for it, alienated parenting or something like that. So parents who've lost children or been separated from them somehow. And so there's common value in that. They both know what it's like to perhaps have, a lying, betraying spouse get away with taking the children. So let's now then quickly, how many aspects does the North Node make? All right. And because the rulers are the same, that sign opposite house, we're going to bring in we're going to bring in the same planets, okay? And so the North Node is that in conjunct to Pluto. Oops, I forgot Neptune. I needed to bring Neptune into that picture, everyone. Apologies for that, because it's still, my math didn't bring it up, but Neptune's still within orb of the in conjunct to the North Node as well. But so now this Jupiter Mercury opposition comes into play with developing the ego, and so does the T-square with that Neptune and Scorpio. Remember to these, that starts to come in here. And so there is a little, as we had talked before, there's discomfort from the waning in conjunct North Node to Mercury. Jupiter to North Node is a waxing sesquisquadrate, okay? And then there's a waning semi-sextile to Mars, and there is that waxing in conjunct with Pluto. So there's enough discomfort here, okay, with this ego moving forward, that, let's say, for example, with regards to the ex, instead of just giving up and self-sacrificing, 6th house Pisces Pluto polarity point, no, the ego has to find that emotional courage to fight. And then as she's evolving and as she's moving forward with relationships into the future, if she's developing trust with herself and trust with source, 6th house polarity point will be similar to reiterating the 12th house Virgo Pluto stuff. Trusting self, trusting source, trusting herself. That's going to help that intuition get sharper and sharper with who to trust in relationships and who not to trust. And as we really start to trust ourselves, which is the same as trusting source, one of the ways in which we will get those intuitive hits is viscerally. In other words, the hair stands up on the back of your neck, or you get the goosebumps, or you just get that intuitive gut hit. And that will start to happen more and more spontaneously, Aries, on instinctive emotional gut levels for the soul. and she'll start to trust these answers that she's receiving. And again, the T-square from Neptune needs to be in here as well. She'll start to trust that intuitive hit rather than her head going into the circular thinking or the self-doubt, you know, all the mercurial things that we can, you know, start to do to override ourselves and to, you know, the distortions of sixth house Pluto polarity point being undercut. Okay, so what I want to do here, finishing up, I want to just go ahead and bring in the whole chart and volunteer. Did you helpful in starting to understand that ego moving forward with that Pluto polarity point?
Yes, yes, definitely. I understand that point of trusting more in myself. And it's interesting because I've kind of come to this point where if I start to think of the other, you know, I'm kind of able to quickly put that back on me and say, I feel that instinctively that I think about other people first, especially like in an intimate relationship scenario. But I'm starting to train my mind, and I don't even know if I'm training it, but I'm more consciously aware that, oh, if I'm thinking that about him, you know, then that's me too. You know what I mean? It's a very interesting kind of new thing for me because it was always just the other person. At least now I'm able to bring myself in, maybe not first completely always, but I think maybe there are times too, and I'm starting to do that first for me, like, you know, some situations with the ex-husband that I'm working on right now as we speak. You know, I decided to do something. Usually I have to get feedback from somebody somewhere, and I'm like, no, I'm going to do this, you know, and it's going to probably cause some negative reactions from him, but I'm like, oh, well, you know. So it goes. I'll just have to deal with the things as they come up. But definitely starting to think more, you know, I find myself a lot of inner dialogue going on, but I can take it and find a quick solution when I take it back to what is best for me here and how, you know, if I'm feeling it's kind of a scenario now of positive projections, whereas in the past it was always negative projections. And I'm finding positive projections that I might send out to someone else, but then I'm able to put it back on that's actually me, and I'm feeling self-love through it.
I'm wanting to say with this, you know, right here, I'm wanting to, with this Pluto polarity point, I'm going to go intuitively discerning what's you and what's someone else, and an ability to hold a healthy egoic sense of self through any and all relationship situations. That's kind of how I'd sum it up, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I need to. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd also say with the Mars-Pluto opposition one more time, it's not so much willing it forward as being able to intuitively energize it forward in the healthiest ways possible.
Okay.
And again, what's best for me, what's best for all concerned. Okay, let's just bring in any comments or questions from anyone else, Leroy. Anything we didn't touch upon?
Oh, pretty quiet here.
Okay.
Very quiet here.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank our volunteer. really appreciate us being able to look at your chart today. Appreciate your feedback. And I'm going to quickly just allow everybody to see. We're going to repeat this 2 more times. If you're one of the new associates from this fall and you want your name in a hat, I'm going to get the other 2 chart examples drawn up for the next couple of months, and we will repeat what we just did 2 more times, so you'll have some multiple examples of how to look at the planetary method of chart interpretation. And then finally, I just did a Venus retrograde in Scorpio Libra class. That is a public webinar if you are interested. And I have 2 more, 3, 4. End of the month, nodal axis in Cancer Capricorn. We're already sending out the enrollments to that in our newsletters. And then, of course, we'll do Jupiter in Sag. And anytime Mercury's retrograde, I have a free public webinar. All right, everyone, thank you for tuning in, and Leroy will have this posted in the archives. It'll show up in your account when you're registered in within the next couple of days. So thank you, volunteer. Thank you, everyone who shows up live, those who listen afterwards, and thank you, Leroy, for always being there with the technical support. See you next month, everyone.